Late on the night of March 13th, 1980, a hush fell over High Point Drive in Ventura, California. Lyman and Charlene Smith went to bed in their well-kept suburban home, thinking about how their lives would change if Lyman received his judgeship. Unbeknownst to them, this would be their last night alive. A predator was watching them, a man who would later be identified as Joseph James DeAngelo. Welcome to Timeless Mysteries. Please like and subscribe. Today we're unpacking the story of a man whose double life spanned burglaries, rapes, and murders, spreading fear from Sacramento down to the southern coast of California. He had many names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, but history will remember him best as the Golden State Killer. So remember that in the late 70s and early 1980s, no one knew they were dealing with a single prolific offender. According to retired detective Larry Crompton, author of Sudden Terror, a book about the East Area Rapist, said, "We were hunting a ghost. We didn't suspect he would pop up across the state under new names."
Because each year I've been praying for the victims and their families that we find out who he is.
DeAngelo operated in 14 separate jurisdictions. Shared databases hadn't even been invented yet. DeAngelo exploited this flaw. There has never been a definitive explanation as to how he gained entry that night. It seems most likely there was an unlocked garage side door that he discreetly relocked from the inside. Regardless, once he was in, that was when the real horror began. According to a neighbor's account, sometime around 2 a.m, a Great Dane named Saxton began acting strange near the gate that led to the Smith property. His owner found this odd but heard nothing else and went back inside. Many years later, investigators would suggest that this dog may have sensed DeAngelo lurking before he entered the house. In 2025, the recurring patterns in DeAngelo's earlier crimes have become crystal clear. He stalked neighborhoods in advance, possibly jogging by or driving through at odd hours. He memorized who left for work early and whose lights stayed on late, all to try to pinpoint which home would be the safest place to enter without being caught. He often tested doors and tampered with windows. Sometimes he would break in beforehand just to learn where things were kept. Sometimes he would leave pre-made ligatures inside of the home. Everything was carefully planned and rehearsed, which kept him off of the suspect list for nearly 38 years. At the time, investigators like Jim Bevins of the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department struggled to connect the dots. The internet didn't exist in any functional sense, Bevins recalled. We couldn't just cross-reference a burglary in Visalia with a homicide in Ventura. We relied on phone calls, memos, and slow teletype. It was a different world. So without digital networks, theories remained local, and message boards or blogs didn't exist yet either. So there was nowhere to pool eyewitness accounts like there is today. It remains unconfirmed whether he planted pre-cut ligatures in the Smith home, but investigators later discovered cord remnants consistent with his signature approach to binding victims. Those who survived his attacks in other cases described waking to a harsh flashlight beam in their eyes.
He's having to live with the fact that we're hearing every single thing that he said and what he did to us, and he's owning it.
Accompanied by a whispered or snarling voice threatening immediate violence. It is likely that Lyman and Charlene experienced this disorienting glare, a masked intruder brandishing a knife or a gun, forcing them to comply by sheer terror. Although early newspaper stories implied the Smiths were killed in their sleep, the presence of ligatures, bruising, and other signs of struggle strongly suggest that they were forced awake and restrained. DeAngelo often began by ordering the wife to tie up the husband's wrist behind his back. Then he would reinforce the knots himself, ensuring the husband could not fight back. In this instance, Lyman's ankles were also found tied. If events followed DeAngelo's established pattern, once Lyman was immobilized, Charlene became the primary target. Survivors from his Northern California rapes recalled being dragged into a separate room, leaving the husband face down, bound, and often gagged. Evidence from the Smith case includes a second bedroom where the sheets and the mattress were reportedly disturbed, suggesting Charlene might have been assaulted there. The coroner would later testify that Charlene likely suffered a forcible sexual attack prior to her death, although confusion in early newspaper reports downplayed or missed these aspects. Precisely why DeAngelo chose to bludgeon the couple to death that night remains subject to debate. Unlike some of his earlier offenses where he repeatedly tormented victims but left them alive, by 1980 he had escalated to murder. If he believed they might identify him or resist in any way, they were dead. One theory is that Lyman attempted to fight back. Another postulates that DeAngelo simply shifted to killing as a matter of routine cleanup. Either way, the killer retrieved a hefty piece of firewood from just outside of the bedroom window, consistent with the fact that the log found at the crime scene was the exact size and shape to what was stored outside on the couple's patio. It appears that when he returned to the bedroom, or perhaps he never left the bedroom, but he delivered a devastating blow to Lyman's skull, possibly while Charlene watched in horror. According to some reconstructions, she let out a shriek and DeAngelo immediately smothered her or struck her next. The overkill force used and the large quantities of blood splatter on the wall above the bed made it clear that he hit both victims multiple times. As for the final tableau, investigators discovered the couple lying partially covered by the sheets, a macabre semblance of calm that contradicted the violent nature of their deaths. Lyman was nude, bound at the wrists and ankle, and Charlene wore only a t-shirt with her wrists tied by an elaborate diamond or lanyard knot. This decorative knot fueled rampant speculation that the killer was someone who knew Charlene. Charlene was an interior decorator, and they knew her well enough to mock her profession through the binding method. Others argued that it's just a coincidence. Perhaps the drapery cord already featured this knot, and DeAngelo only tightened it. What is generally accepted is that Charlene's ankles were either let free or possibly retied at some point, long enough for a sexual assault to occur, and that her final position showed more evidence of bruising than Lyman's, consistent with prolonged struggle. When Charlene and Lyman did not emerge from their home for several days, it was Lyman's 12-year-old son Gary who discovered the crime on March 16th. He noticed newspapers piling up on the porch, found the house strangely locked in some places but ransacked in others. He eventually ventured into the master bedroom. The scene he encountered was so disturbing that early police statements emphasized how the couple appeared almost peaceful, presumably to shield the boy from the full brutality. However, forensic teams soon uncovered ligature marks, disheveled bedding in the spare room, and shattered skulls, pointing to severe blunt force trauma. The coroner, Ronald Kornblum, examined their adrenal glands in an attempt to determine how much fear they had experienced beforehand, but the findings were inconclusive. These discrepancies caused significant confusion because Charlene's wrists were bound with a knot rarely seen in everyday homicides. Detectives and press leaned toward the theory of a personal grudge. After all, Lyman had business associates who were bitter over failed investments, and Charlene was reputed to have romantic entanglements. It was difficult for Ventura investigators to grasp that a total stranger, someone with a proven history of random home invasions, would take the time to fashion or utilize a decorative knot. Yet behind the scenes, a few detectives from other counties started noticing parallels to the murders in Goleta and Dana Point. Although they had their own unique twists, some victims had been shot rather than bludgeoned, for instance. The puzzle was not solved until DNA technology finally linked the Smith crime to the as yet unidentified original Night Stalker, confirming that Charlene had indeed been raped before her death and that the same man attacked multiple couples across the state. In the decades that followed, countless theories emerged on old message boards and early blog posts. People speculated about ex-lovers, revenge plots, and cult symbolism with the diamond knot. Without modern social media or a centralized database, tips remained fragmented. It wasn't until the late 2000s that a handful of amateur sleuths and retired law enforcement started piecing everything together online. In hindsight, the blog accounts that surfaced around 2009 provided many specific details, such as the neighbor's dog Saxton and other neighbors hearing a scream in the night, or the possibility that DeAngelo relocked a side door that was usually left open to avoid suspicion. These are not firmly documented in any official records, but they do align with known patterns of his behavior. While no one can be absolutely certain of the moment-by-moment sequence of that night, logical inference based on DeAngelo's well-established modus operandi indicate that he likely killed them both to eliminate witnesses. The diamond knot on Charlene's wrists remains one of the most perplexing elements of this case. Was it a psychological flourish, a genuine coincidence, or just a convenient piece of drapery cord that happened to have a decorative loop? What is certain is that the crime scene confounded early investigators. It seemed too personal, too staged, and the victimology suggested strong personal motives. Charlene and Lyman were casualties in a larger campaign of terror by a predator who had grown increasingly lethal. Their final moments, as best as can be reconstructed, consisted of extreme fear, forced compliance, and savage violence that ended only when DeAngelo left them bludgeoned to death in their own bed.
I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm really sorry to everyone I've heard. Thank you, Your Honor.
An outcome that was heartbreakingly consistent with his evolution into a remorseless killer. Ultimately, the scenario of that night stands as both tragic and emblematic of the way DeAngelo adapted his methods, leveraging confusion and fear to ensure total dominance. Even decades later, the horrifying details reflected a man who used any means necessary to fulfill his sadistic need for control. Although many of the precise details remain uncertain, the overall account is clear. The Smiths fell victim to a methodical, rage-driven intruder who took pleasure not only in subduing them physically, but in orchestrating every aspect of their last nightmare on Earth. DeAngelo's arrest on April 24, 2018 in a quiet Sacramento suburb stunned the nation. He was an ex-police officer whose unassuming retirement masked decades of hidden violence. Rather than endure a drawn-out jury trial, DeAngelo pled guilty to 13 murders and numerous other crimes, a strategic choice that spared him from a potential death penalty. The proceedings were held in Sacramento County Superior Court with Judge Michael Bowman presiding. Prosecutors from several counties collaborated on the case, but the lead counsel who oversaw the final sentencing from the Sacramento County District Attorney's Office was DA Anne Marie Schubert. Victims and families delivered powerful impact statements that spanned several days, describing traumas extending back more than 40 years. DeAngelo, who had once seemed unstoppable, sat in a wheelchair, offering little outward reaction, an anticlimactic final portrait of a man who once thrived on controlling every situation. Judge Bowman handed down multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, ensuring DeAngelo would be behind bars until the day he dies. He is currently serving his time at California State Pen Kakaran in protective custody to avoid potential violence from other inmates. As with many serial predators, even the confinement of a dangerous prison environment doesn't seem like enough justice for the unspeakable damage he inflicted. So how does a former law enforcement officer entrusted with community safety become one of the most infamous serial offenders in history? According to Dr. O'Toole, he lived off the terror he caused. Each successful break-in, rape, or murder further validated that warped view that he was above everyone else, including the system. I guess he was wrong. The Golden State Killer was ultimately cornered by his own DNA, that silent witness that he could never fully hide from. Joseph James DeAngelo was terrifying, but you don't want to miss what's next. This killer had no victim profile. No one was safe. He had no clear pattern. His crimes were nearly impossible to predict. He traveled extensively. He took notes from other infamous killers to refine his own methods. When authorities searched his prison cell, they found 11 skulls drawn on paper believed to represent his victims. The full extent of his crimes remain a mystery. Need a hint? Which serial killer buried kill kits across the United States, allowing him to carry out murders years after hiding them? Think you know? Put your answers in the comment below. As always, stay kind, be vigilant, and always question the truth. I'll see you in the next video.